We are looking at one of the most important concluding ideas in Alan Tate's theory of poetry. Up to this point, Tate has explained what tension is, why poetry fails when extension and intention become separated, and how great poetry keeps both together. Now he asks a practical question. How does a poet actually create this balance? How does a poet move toward the ideal state of tension? This slide answers that question. Notice the title, Reaching the Golden Mean. The phrase golden mean means the perfect balance between two extremes. For Tate, the two extremes are pure extension, which is pure logic, and pure intention, which is pure emotion and imagination. A great poem avoids both extremes and arrives at a balanced middle position. That middle position is called tension. Notice the black box in the center. It says, tension, the golden mean. This is the destination. Everything on this slide moves toward that center. Now let us look at the first path. The top red arrow is called the metaphysical strategy. Notice where the arrow begins. It begins at the extensive or denotative end. In simple language, it starts with logic. It starts with facts. It starts with clear reasoning. It starts with literal meaning. Then the poet gradually pushes this logical foundation toward imagination, symbolism, emotion, and deeper significance. This is the method used by many metaphysical poets. Think about John Donne. Donne often starts with something ordinary and logical. A compass, a flea, the sun, a map. At first these things seem simple and concrete. But then he transforms them into profound symbols of love, faith, death, or spirituality. The poem begins in logic and moves toward imagination. That is why Tate calls it the metaphysical strategy. Let us imagine a teacher explaining friendship. The teacher starts with a simple fact. Friends stay connected even when they are far apart. Then the teacher uses the image of two compass legs. One leg moves around the circle. The other remains fixed. Suddenly the logical fact becomes a beautiful symbol of love and loyalty. This movement from reason to imagination is exactly what Tate means. Now let us examine the second path. The blue arrow is called the symbolist strategy. Notice that the direction is reversed. The symbolist poet begins with feeling. The poem may begin with a mood, a dream, a mysterious sensation, a vague emotional experience. The poet starts with intention. The starting point is emotion and imagination. Then the poet gradually gives that emotion shape, structure, and meaning. The poet moves toward order and rational understanding. For example, imagine a poet feels loneliness. At first it is only a feeling. The feeling has no clear form. Then the poet creates images. Perhaps an empty street, a fading lamp, a silent window. The poet organizes these images carefully. The emotion slowly becomes structured meaning. This movement from feeling toward order is the symbolist strategy. Now compare the two strategies. The metaphysical poet starts with logic and moves toward emotion. The symbolist poet starts with emotion and moves toward logic. The starting points are different. The directions are opposite, but the goal is identical. Both arrows are moving toward tension. This is the most important point of the slide. Tate is not saying one strategy is right and the other is wrong. He respects both. He believes both can produce great poetry. What matters is whether they successfully unite extension and intention. Now look at the highlighted statement at the bottom. Tate views both strategies at their best as great, though incomplete on their own. This sentence contains a subtle idea. Tate admires both traditions. He admires great metaphysical poetry. He admires great symbolist poetry. However, he believes that each strategy naturally favors one side more than the other. The metaphysical poet naturally leans toward logic. The symbolist poet naturally leans toward emotion. Therefore, each strategy remains slightly incomplete if taken alone. The highest achievement occurs when a poem reaches complete balance. Think of a bridge. One side of the bridge begins on one riverbank. The other side begins on the opposite bank. Workers build toward the middle. Eventually the two sides meet. Only then is the bridge complete. The metaphysical strategy builds from the side of logic. The symbolist strategy builds from the side of emotion. Tension is the point where both sides meet. That meeting point creates poetic unity. So the central lesson of this slide is simple. There are different roads to great poetry. Some poets begin with reason and move toward imagination. Some poets begin with imagination and move toward reason. But all great poetry aims for the same destination, the harmonious union of extension and intention. That harmonious union is what Alan Tate calls tension, the golden mean, and the highest achievement of poetic art. We have now reached what Alan Tate considers the finest example of his theory in action. After explaining extension, intention, tension, poetic failures, and poetic strategies, Tate finally asks, can we find a poem where all these elements come together perfectly? His answer is yes. That poet is John Donne. That poem is A Valediction, Forbidding Mourning. Tate presents Donne as the supreme example of successful poetic tension. For him, Donne achieves something that very few poets achieve. He perfectly unites logic and emotion, reason and imagination, extension and intention. Let us understand how. First, we need to understand the situation in the poem. The speaker is preparing to leave his beloved. A separation is about to occur. Normally, lovers would feel sadness, grief, and anxiety. But the speaker tells his beloved not to mourn. He says their separation should not be viewed as a loss. Instead, it should be understood as something deeper. This is where the famous lines on the slide appear. Our two souls, therefore, which are one, though I must go, endure not yet a breach, but an expansion, like gold to airy thinness beat. Now let us unpack these lines carefully. The speaker says that although he must leave, their souls remain united. The separation is not a break. It is not destruction. It is not division. Instead, it is an expansion. The love stretches outward while remaining one. This is a beautiful idea. But notice how Donne expresses it. He does not simply say, our love remains strong. That would be too simple. Instead, he introduces an unexpected comparison. He compares love to gold. Specifically, he compares it to gold beaten into an extremely thin sheet. This is where Tate becomes fascinated. Let us first examine the extension. Remember that extension means literal, logical, factual meaning. Gold can actually be beaten into thin sheets. This is a real physical process. Goldsmiths have done this for centuries. The statement is scientifically and logically true. Nothing irrational is happening. The comparison has a solid literal foundation. This is important. The image can withstand logical examination. Now let us move to intention. What emotional and symbolic meanings emerge from this image? Gold is valuable. Gold is beautiful. Gold is durable. Gold does not easily break. When gold is stretched, it does not lose its essential nature. It simply becomes wider. Suddenly the image acquires emotional depth. The lovers' souls resemble gold. Distance cannot destroy them. Separation only extends their presence. The love remains precious and unified. Now notice what has happened. The literal meaning remains intact. The figurative meaning also remains intact. Neither one damages the other. The physical reality of gold supports the emotional meaning. The emotional meaning grows naturally from the physical reality. This is exactly what Tate means by tension. Extension and intention are working together. Neither dominates. Neither collapses. Both strengthen each other. Now imagine what would happen if Donne failed. If he focused only on logic, the poem would sound like a scientific explanation of metal. The emotion would disappear. If he focused only on emotion, the image might become vague and sentimental. The logical foundation would disappear. Instead, Donne achieves both at the same time. The image is intellectually convincing and emotionally powerful. This is why Tate admires Donne so much. In fact, Donne represents the ideal metaphysical poet. He begins with a logical observation. Then he pushes it toward profound emotional and spiritual significance. The result is neither cold logic nor uncontrolled emotion. The result is poetic unity. Think about a bridge. One side represents extension. The other side represents intention. Most poets build from one side but never fully connect to the other. Donne completes the bridge. Logic reaches emotion. Emotion reaches logic. The two meet perfectly in the middle. That meeting point is tension. This is why Tate calls Donne the ultimate example. When we examine the image literally, it works. When we examine it symbolically, it works. When we examine it emotionally, it works. When we examine it logically, it works. The poem survives every test. And according to Alan Tate, that is the mark of truly great poetry. So the central lesson of this slide is this. John Donne's image of gold being beaten into airy thinness demonstrates the perfect fusion of extension and intention. The comparison is literally true, logically sound, emotionally moving, and symbolically rich. For Tate, this makes a valediction, forbidding mourning, one of the greatest examples of poetic tension in English literature. This slide takes us even deeper into why Alan Tate considers John Donne's image of gold to be one of the greatest examples of poetic tension in English literature. The title is Anatomy of Perfection, Donne. The word anatomy means breaking something down into its parts so that we can understand how it works. Tate is now dissecting Donne's famous image step by step. He wants to show us exactly how extension and intention become perfectly united. Look at the image at the top. We begin with a solid block of gold. Then the gold is hammered and stretched into a thin sheet. This physical process is the foundation of the entire metaphor. The remarkable thing is that the literal process and the figurative meaning are inseparable. Let us start with the left side of the slide. This is extension, or literal meaning. Remember that extension refers to the logical, factual, and denotative aspect of language. At the literal level, gold is a real metal. It has physical properties. It occupies space. It has weight. It can be measured. It can be touched. Most importantly, it is malleable. Malleable means that it can be beaten into thinner and thinner sheets without breaking apart. This is not imagination. This is scientific reality. A goldsmith can actually do this. The statement is logically true. The image survives literal examination. If a scientist read these lines, the scientist would not object. The physical process is accurate. This is what Tate means by strong extension. The poem stands firmly on reality. Now let us move to the right side of the slide. This is intention, or figurative meaning. Here we leave the physical world and enter the world of symbolism. The lovers' souls are not pieces of metal. They are spiritual realities. Unlike gold, souls do not occupy physical space. You cannot weigh them. You cannot measure them. You cannot place them on a scale. The lovers' souls symbolize unity, love, devotion, and spiritual connection. When Donne speaks of two souls becoming one, he is describing something infinite and spiritual. So we now have two very different things. On one side we have physical gold. On the other side we have spiritual love. At first glance, they seem completely unrelated. One belongs to the material world. The other belongs to the spiritual world. One is finite. The other appears infinite. One is physical. The other is emotional and spiritual. Now comes Tate's central insight. Look at the middle box labeled the tension synthesis. This is the heart of the slide. Tate argues that the physical property of gold perfectly contains the figurative meaning. Think carefully about what happens when gold is beaten thinner. It stretches outward. Its surface expands. Yet it remains one piece. It does not break apart. Its unity remains intact. Now compare this with the lovers. The lovers become physically separated. Distance increases. Space expands between them. Yet their love remains one. Their spiritual unity remains intact. Do you see the connection? The literal property of gold directly supports the figurative meaning of love. The metaphor is not arbitrary. It is not random. It grows naturally from the physical reality. This is why Tate calls it perfection. The literal meaning and the figurative meaning are fused together. Now imagine removing the gold image. What would happen? The emotional meaning would become weaker. The spiritual idea would lose its concrete foundation. Now imagine removing the spiritual meaning. What would happen? The gold would become merely a scientific fact. The beauty of the poem would disappear. Both sides need each other. This is exactly what Tate means when he says, if you reject the gold, you reject the meaning. The image and the idea cannot be separated. The literal reality creates the figurative significance. The figurative significance gives value to the literal reality. This is the perfect union of extension and intention. Let us compare this with the failures we studied earlier. In Malay's poetry, emotion existed but literal support was weak. In Thomson's poetry, imagery became confused under close examination. In Cowley's poetry, logic existed but imagination became absurd. In Donne's poetry, neither problem appears. The logic remains strong. The imagination remains powerful. The literal meaning survives. The symbolic meaning survives. The poem succeeds from every angle. This is why Tate places Donne at the summit of poetic achievement. For Tate, a great poem is not one that chooses between logic and emotion. It is one that unites them so completely that they become inseparable. That is precisely what happens in Donne's image of gold. The physical process of stretching gold and the spiritual reality of enduring love become one unified meaning. And that perfect unity is what Alan Tate calls tension. We have now reached what Alan Tate considers the highest achievement of poetic art. Notice the title of the slide, The Pinnacle of Tension, Dante Alighieri. The word pinnacle means the highest point, the summit, the absolute peak. Earlier, Tate admired John Donne as a near-perfect example of poetic tension. But here he goes even further. He suggests that Dante represents the ultimate realization of tension. In other words, if Donne demonstrates the theory beautifully, Dante demonstrates it on the grandest possible scale. Let us understand why. First, let us look at the passage. These lines come from the Divine Comedy, specifically from the Inferno, in the Circle of Lust. The speaker is Francesca da Rimini, one of the famous souls punished in hell. She tells Dante about the place where she was born. At first glance, the lines seem simple. She is merely describing geography. She says that her town lies near the place where the River Po flows into the sea. This appears to be a straightforward geographical statement. Nothing seems particularly poetic or extraordinary. And this is exactly where Tate wants us to pay attention. Because beneath this simple description lies an astonishing depth of meaning. Let us begin with extension. Remember that extension refers to literal meaning. Literally, Francesca is describing a real location. There is a real River Po. There is a real coastline. There is a real town. A historian or geographer could verify these facts. The statement is precise. The statement is factual. The statement is logically true. The literal level is perfectly stable. Now let us move to intention. What symbolic meanings exist beneath the surface? Notice the phrase about the river descending toward the sea to find peace. At the literal level, this is simply how rivers behave. They flow toward larger bodies of water. But figuratively, the image becomes much richer. The river's journey can symbolize the human soul's search for rest. It can symbolize destiny. It can symbolize the movement of life toward its final end. It can symbolize longing for union. It can symbolize the desire for peace after struggle. Suddenly, a simple geographical fact becomes a profound spiritual image. Now think about Francesca's situation. She is speaking from hell. She is a soul trapped by the consequences of earthly passion. She longs for peace but cannot fully possess it. The image of the river moving toward the sea therefore gains even greater emotional significance. The literal landscape reflects an emotional and spiritual reality. This is what Tate admires. The symbolism does not float above the literal meaning. It grows naturally from it. The geography remains real. The symbolism remains real. Neither destroys the other. Now let us think about why Dante impresses Tate so much. In many poets, literal meaning and symbolic meaning exist side by side. In Dante, they seem fused together. The physical world and the spiritual world constantly mirror each other. A mountain is both a mountain and a spiritual journey. A forest is both a forest and a state of moral confusion. A river is both a river and a symbol of human destiny. Hell is both a place and a representation of spiritual reality. Everything operates simultaneously on multiple levels. This is why Dante is so important to Tate. Dante does not force symbolism onto reality. Instead, reality itself becomes symbolic. The literal and the figurative become inseparable. This is the highest form of tension. Think of the poets we studied earlier. Millais failed because emotion overwhelmed literal meaning. Cowley failed because logic overwhelmed imagination. Even great poets often lean toward one side. Dante achieves something rarer. He maintains complete balance. His literal descriptions remain vivid and concrete. His symbolic meanings remain profound and universal. Every level strengthens every other level. This is why Tate places Dante at the summit. For Tate, Dante proves that poetry can contain historical reality, physical reality, emotional reality, moral reality, religious reality, philosophical reality, and artistic beauty, all at the same time. That is the fullest possible expression of tension. So the central lesson of this slide is this. Dante represents the pinnacle of poetic tension because his poetry unites literal reality and symbolic meaning so completely that they become inseparable. A geographical description remains a geographical description, yet simultaneously becomes a spiritual and emotional vision. For Alan Tate, this perfect fusion makes Dante the highest achievement of poetic art.